Sorry about that. Took me a second to figure out what was going on wrong, so I had to
No, that's
restart things.
okay. We're only 4 minutes past the expected start time, so we're gonna figure that
Yeah,
out.
it's comfortable. Fashionably late, right?
Exactly. You just did it out of fashion.
Okay, so what's the T-shirt you're wearing there?
Oh, sorry. I gotta rep my merch here.
Wrapping the
It says
merch.
equal
Okay,
shared parenting, healthier relationships. So,
very cool.
okay.
And is
So,
there a website people could go to go get that? Like, I mean,
so,
awesome.
so this is a Patreon exclusive design.
Well, there you
Dadvocate.net
go.
for the rest. Here, you plug a little bit too. We can't just plug me only.
I have nothing to plug though. I don't know.
If you want to learn a little bit more about different angles of removing antisocial toxic behavior from yourself, that's the channel you'll want to go to, which I think deep down we all should want that.
I would believe so. Yeah, antisocial is never good. I appreciate you doing this evening, by the way. Thank you so much for having this discussion, and being willing to just have the conversation. It's really big. So I appreciate you for being open to the dialogue.
Yeah, it is. I'm sure a lot of people are very surprised and are expecting us to just be absolutely screaming at each other throughout this entire time. But like I've said to you privately, I think that our audiences are going to have a lot to learn from this whole discussion. So I'm excited. So
Cool.
I will start off by saying this is my stance. This is my firm position, my official position going into the discussion is
Sure.
that the current system in which family court exists creates a biased disadvantage for fathers attempting to attain custody, and that
Okay.
there is not enough evidence to disprove that fathers are disadvantaged when pursuing custody compared to mothers.
Okay. So there isn't enough evidence to prove that doesn't exist. Is there enough evidence to show that there is a bias? We can get into that later, but would it be fair to say that you do think there is enough evidence to show there is a bias?
Correct.
Okay, that's fair. All right. Well, since you laid out your opinion, I will jump in and say that I think you've talked before that there's a baseline of common ground that we both agree on, I think, right? And I think I want to get
Yes.
that out of saying that we are both for fathers being more involved, fathers being active parents, fathers having more custody, and being a part of their child's lives. I think we both agree that that's beneficial in the majority of cases, right? Outside of those fringe cases where we might be talking about abuse or neglect, that for the most part, these fathers are fit parents and they should be encouraged to have more custody. And that, I think another point we both agree on is that fathers are actively discouraged from seeking that custody a lot of the time. And so we would both be against that of encouraging men to seek out that custody. And I think that's why for me, I want to have this discussion because I think it's important that we're accurate about describing the landscape in courts, because I think there's a danger if we over exaggerate. If we say that the problem is bigger than it actually is, then that's just going to exacerbate that problem, right? It's going to discourage more men from seeking custody. But at the same time, I think, it's fair to say that if we underestimate how big that problem is, that men go blindly into seeking custody without knowing what some of the issues might be, that then they're not going to have good cases, they're not going to have good outcomes, and they may feel frustrated with that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and so the other side of that coin, because it wasn't until you made your video response to me that I realized that there even was a harm in constantly bringing up over and over again how disenfranchised fathers are. Because I was so focused on the fact that I found it so unfair to say things like, well, fathers can just get custody when they ask for it. Because I'm looking at it through the lens of how many fathers did fight. They truly did. How many of them fought their butts off, were perfectly fit, active, not even accused of anything, and still didn't get it. I think it's so unfair to say that still. But there is starting to become an issue with how many people are using the biases that I do believe exist as reasoning for not fighting, which was never
Yeah,
my point. That was
sure.
not my point in bringing any of it up, was to discourage fathers from fighting for custody. And so that's another reason that I'm like, oh, I got to do this live with Brent so that I can clarify that.
Yeah, yeah, no, agreed. And that's I think the concern is like having that negative viewpoint from it is maybe just actively discouraging men, but it's also maybe being used as a talking point for those who may have had their custody unfairly, like may have had their custody fairly denied to them, to be able to latch on to that, right? And I know that like it's probably unfair to say, but like a lot of my interactions with fathers' rights advocates and all of that have been a lot of discussions about, oh, I struggled with custody, and then you take 2 minutes to go look up their court records, and they have a history of having like a protective order against them or domestic violence and things like that. And I want to make sure we're talking like that is not the majority. It happens, but that is not what we're really wanting to talk about. Like we want to make sure that we're clear. Like there's bias. The bias that we're trying to examine tonight is about in those vast majority of cases, right, of those fit fathers.
Yeah, and so another reason that I'm trying to address the whole talking point of, oh, well, fathers just can get custody if they just ask for it. Fathers can get custody if they just ask for it, is that when that becomes the popular theory that people actually believe, that it is truly super majorative that they can get it, then as a consequence, it's leading people to societally believe that when fathers are not getting custody, it's because they are abusive. And we're seeing this in conversations where people are saying things like, well, if they're not getting it, then it might be because they're actually a deadbeat or abusive, when in reality, we just both agreed that majoritively they're not.
Sure, but yeah, but let's go into that. So you say there, like, that it was a theory. And I think in your original video, you talked about how you felt it was unfair for one statistic from one study to be used to kind of build that narrative. And I think where that narrative comes from, and I think it's shared in my response, right, that it wasn't just one study, right, that throughout the 80s and 90s and even the 2000s, the vast majority of states, the overwhelming majority of states, conducted extensive bias studies, gender bias studies in courts. And they are today the most comprehensive studies that have been done by any organizations into bias in family court. And unanimously, they did not find any evidence of systemic judicial bias against fathers in court, right? They found some evidence of a judicial bias against mothers in a number of cases, but none across the board found any judicial bias against fathers. So I just would, just talk to that, when you say you don't feel that there's enough evidence to show that that doesn't exist, right? These are, like I said, the most comprehensive state studies done, and they were specifically about family court, and they could not really show that bias. So why do you think that would be?
So I would actually disagree. So I actually went through all of the studies that you did show me, and I was wrong. There were more. Okay. So I went through them.
There's a lot more, yeah.
And I was able to find evidence of judicial bias in almost every single one of these studies. So okay. We'll start with, let's go to, hold on. So the Massachusetts study, first off the top, because that's the most popular one, the one that everyone uses, the one that I brought up. So first of all, if you actually bring up this study on Wikipedia, Wikipedia does not consider this a reliable study, which that's just Wikipedia. And you could even say Wikipedia is not reliable.
I was going to say, you could publicly edit Wikipedia. So I mean,
one unreliable resource is saying that another resource is unreliable. So I'll take that.
Sure. Okay.
But the reason that I agree that it's unreliable is because that study only took the court decisions of temporary orders for initial divorce proceedings, which leaves out the entire section of unmarried fathers. So we're not able to get a clear-cut determination of what actually the majority of those fathers going for custody get. Because in Massachusetts at the time that this whole study was taking place, it was the precedent that at an initial divorce proceeding, as long as both parents show up, they should get joint custody. But we have no idea even what that looks like for unmarried fathers with paternity established. We don't know. So unfortunately,
when you say that this is about like they had those temporary orders, and that was across all of Massachusetts.
Yeah, that was for the whole study. So they
Okay,
really only
so
studied
that
temporary orders.
So that study in Massachusetts, right? It didn't just refer to cases inside Massachusetts, as I pointed out in my video, right? It also looked at a
Yeah.
study that was done in Los Angeles County and also a nationwide study that also replicated those same results. So I think you talked about this in your video, right? That Massachusetts was the only state that could show this because Massachusetts had these temporary orders for joint custody.
Yes.
Why then do we see those same results nationwide and in LA?
So yes, I was wrong about that. And then when I found the other studies, like I said, they actually do contain evidence of bias for fathers. So,
I was there, like if
oh,
Massachusetts is showing those results because of the temporary joint custody order, but that's a feature only of Massachusetts, why is those same study replicating those same numbers in LA and nationwide?
so the nationwide, I think we agreed. The nationwide number is closer to when fathers request custody. So when they actually go through all of the work, hiring the lawyer or doing the research to self-represent, prose, all that, whatever it is that they need to do to spend the money to do the work, they're putting in the effort. These are all fathers putting in the effort. Nationwide, it was only 51% got it.
So they got it half the time.
They got some custody when they fought for it half the time. To me, this is where the opinion differs. To me, that's kind of abysmal.
You think 50% of fathers getting custody when they ask for it is abysmal?
I do. I do because,
On what?
and the reason for that is that there is so much important rights that you have as the custodial parent, namely being if your child is on their deathbed and you are not custodial, you could be
Mhm.
denied visiting to see your child on their deathbed just for one,
Sure,
just for
but
starters.
I think I was trying to get to the point of like if you think that 50% of men getting the custody they ask for is abysmal, what does unbiased custody requests look like for men? How often do men have to get custody when they request it for it to not look like bias? I guess is my question. If 50-50 isn't it, where does it come from that they should get 75 or 80%?
If you are a fit and active father and you
Yeah,
present a reliable, structured format through which you could equitably parent alongside the other parent,
sure.
there's no accusations of abuse. I think that those fathers should retain custody 100% of the time.
But they're not
They should
retaining,
stay
right?
custody.
These are requests for custody. So the study doesn't show you how many of those fathers have custody at the time. Typically, nationwide, I think from the studies that I've seen, it's only around about between 5 and 15% of fathers have sole custody at the time of divorce proceedings or doing the primary caretaking at the time of divorce proceedings. So we're still in a state where, like I said in my video, men go into court requesting to be sole parents. They come out of court being the sole parent more likely than when they went in at 2 or 3 times the rate. So simply asking for custody is going to make you 2 or 3 times more likely to be the custodial parent. And that's why I'm like, so where is the bias there, right? If you're going to be 3 times more likely to be the parent, be the primary parent by asking for it, where does that bias come from, or what does that number have to
Oh,
look like before you're comfortable saying, I don't think there's any more bias? Is it 5 times? Is it six
see,
times?
See, I think that we're both interpreting the results differently because from what I'm
Okay.
understanding, the gross majority of the data that we're looking at is not fathers are receiving sole custody 2 to 3 times at the rate that they're asking for it. They are achieving any modicum of custody, not sole. And so I want to clarify. I do not think any parent should request sole custody outside of very extreme circumstances. I would not
Okay.
encourage my audience, the fathers, to request sole custody unless it is an emergency. I wouldn't because I do support equal shared parenting, not so I would definitely I think that we might be interpreting the data a little bit differently, but it is my understanding that when fathers who do not have any custody nationwide request some custody, they are granted some custody 51% of the time. And to me, that's abysmal.
But we don't know how much, right?
Yeah, but if that is the number, I think it's bad. And so to me, if you're a fit, active father with no abuse and you can provide an equitable plan of parenting, it should be 100%.
Okay.
Now, I'm about to say that's not the cases of most fathers.
Like,
but
yeah,
but
no,
the reason
absolutely.
that we're not seeing more fathers able to present like, here is my equitable parenting time schedule, is because that's not the way that the courts are set up. The current model at which it is expected to achieve custody, it's not the way it should be set up. What I would like to see is, if you want custody, you come in and you show how you are fit, you prove that you are fit and active, you prove that you're involved and that you can provide some equitable form of childcare for your child as the other parent. But instead, what we currently have are models in which, if you are an unmarried father, then the woman has automatic sole physical and legal custody. And the only way for you to get any custody without her agreeing to it, if she contests your joint custody at all, your next job is to prove her unfit. Not prove yourself fit. You have to prove the mother unfit to achieve custody as an unmarried single father. And I think that
to what? To get sole custody? Or are you saying that that's for joint custody as well?
Any custody. And then the reason for this is because technically on paper, if one parent is requesting joint custody, the court should consider it. But the language through which the courts have to consider the joint custody puts upon the father that he has to break through the threshold of a considerable change in circumstance. And the simple presentation of a fit father is not enough for the courts to determine a proper change in circumstance. Only like the mother being abusive or some other very dramatic event would be enough for them to consider a proper change in circumstance to change the custody from the mother having sole to joint. And that puts fathers at a very disadvantaged position.
Okay. So I would disagree strongly with that. I don't think that's the case at all, and that's not the case that we see in the vast majority of cases in the country at all, and especially from those studies, right? You do not have to show that the mother is unfit to get custody. In fact, a number of those gender bias studies from the States were all talking about how, I think, which ones I was reading today? Minnesota's, for instance, was talking about how men are drastically overvalued for being involved fathers. And even if they only do 5 to 10% of the childcare, they're given a much greater bias when it comes to doing custody, and are more likely to be granted custody time with their kids just because they show that they're involved, and because that is so rare. We can also see this in just how that data has changed, right? Because a lot of those studies, I think you complained about how they were done like 30 or 40 years ago. And when we look at certain states about how that split has changed, we can see that that's not the case in the vast majority, right? Because if that was still the case, that you have to prove that the mother is unfit, then we'd only be talking about those 10% of cases that are contested, right? For the 90% that never go to court, that could not be the case because they're not contesting the mother. So if you have to contest the mother in order to get joint custody, that cannot be true 90% of the time. They are not contested. And we know that, for instance, like in Wisconsin, in like 1988, mothers were getting sole custody 80% of the time, right? High up there, men were getting joint custody very unfairly. In 2008, that is now down to about 45% of cases where mothers get sole custody. That can't be the case that men aren't getting joint custody if they're not contesting it, because most of those are not contested. If mothers get sole custody without men contesting it, that number has to be 90. That number has to be, otherwise men are getting custody without contesting it, which is what we're seeing in the national numbers. That fewer women over the last 2, 3, 4 decades are getting sole custody, and that joint and split custodies or unequal joint custodies are the preferred that courts are assigning.
So you're saying that, are you talking about the 90% of cases that are settled outside of court?
Yeah, so like so as I understand your point, it was that for the most part, the mother has sole custody unless the father contends it. Unless she agrees to it or they contest it, they will not get joint custody. And if that was the case, then those 90% that are done by agreement would be far more skewed towards sole custody. Why would a mother agree to joint custody? Unless you're saying that mothers do agree to joint custody at extremely high rates in uncontested
Oh, actually,
custody hearings.
no, actually, one of the articles that you sent me had a part in it that actually stated pretty clearly that when mediation is required, mothers are actually very non-compliant. Here we go. The North Carolina study. In sum, our study, mothers did not routinely agree to joint physical custody in mandatory mediation. And so that means that they're generally unwilling to cooperate with that. Again, these are we're only going to talk about the 10% of like what actually goes to family court, because this is where the bias comes in. The 90% of other cases, I feel like we can't even really properly talk about them because those are all whatever they agreed on. So the court's bias doesn't even apply there. Does that make sense?
Agreed, right? No, absolutely. I think if you don't go to court, right, there isn't court bias. But the fact that so many are agreed, right, and the fact that, like I said, only about half of those that go to court, you know, have that split, right? Like we're seeing then for the vast majority of cases, men are getting the equal and joint custody time that they want. So if we're only talking about the ones where they go to court, we're talking about 10% of cases. So we've already assumed that the vast majority of custody cases can't be biased, right? They are what you agree to. They are what you guys have come up with. There is no judicial bias that's preventing men from getting the custody that they did. In a lot of those cases, it's going to come down to how well you co-parent. It's going to come down to how much childcare were you doing before the marriage, and those are what are going to affect your custody, not a biased judge. So sounds like we agree on
I have some quotes from the studies that you did send me that actually discuss biases from the judges. But I will say this regarding the 90% outside of there, I would still argue that family court bias plays a role in those 90% because starting with the fact that we both agreed on, which is that a ridiculous amount of lawyers are telling men not to fight for custody. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the family court bias begins, is because a lot of these men can't even start their journey because they're starting off with poor counsel.
Not necessarily that they're starting off with poor counsel, right? I think lawyers have a job to do, and I think anybody who thinks that a lawyer is talking themselves out of money has never met a lawyer first, right? Like they love money and will happily take on a case. So it could either be that these are family lawyers who necessarily don't want to take a losing case because it looks bad on their record. Maybe that's why. But for the most part, I think it's also, you've got to admit that, well, you don't have to admit, but it could be that these lawyers are counseling their clients in this manner because they have unrealistic expectations of what they're going to get in custody. And again, those gender bias studies showed that, in that they showed that a lot of times men go into these custody cases expecting, having done 0, 5, or 10% of custody in the marriage, that they're going to rip sole custody from the mother. And so a lot of them get discouraged from going seeking this because they're like, look, this is not going to happen. And, you know, since we talked about having to doing this discussion, you know, I think we've both probably had a couple of people from like some of your audience showing up in my comments and my audience showing up in yours. And I had a conversation with two gentlemen in particular who absolutely insisted that there was court bias. And in talking to them about their stories were they were frustrated, and there is bias because they had a mother who, she wasn't doing drugs, she wasn't abusing the child, but they were told by their lawyers there was no chance that they were going to get sole custody. And I think we both agree, like, if you're a fit parent, then there shouldn't really be an expectation of you ripping sole custody. So I think we have to be careful when we say, oh, they're discouraged by lawyers, because it could also be that they're having these unrealistic expectations of saying, well, I want to take the kids from mom, and being told by the lawyer that, look, unless you have a valid reason to rip custody from that parent, that's just not going to happen in court.
So before I read some of these things from some of these studies, I will argue this. If the presumption defers when a lawyer is advising men not to pursue custody, that it is more probable that the lawyer is telling him not to do so because the man is unreasonable as
Mhm.
opposed to the probability that it is because he has a more disadvantaged time in court,
Yeah.
that's a bias against men, personally. Because the assumption then becomes that the lawyer is dealing with more unreasonable men than unreasonable court setups that are already disadvantaged to men.
Okay. I'm not sure if that shows gender bias, but I think we would agree that, yeah, like those lawyers are probably seeing more unrealistic expectations from those men. But I think, again, that talks into why it's important that we talk openly and honestly about this, right? Of the fact that, the real issue at the heart of it, right, is that, to make the claim of bias, we'd have to show that men are somehow losing custody, that they have more custody or more custody time in marriage, and they don't get it on the other side of the courts, right? And in so men don't typically do a lot of childcare. I think we both would that be a fair thing that we find agreement on that it's very rare to find 50-50 in marriage.
It's all, yeah, especially when it comes to the expectations of financial contribution as well. So there's a lot of societal aspects at play there. I think that
Sure.
the
Yeah.
numbers we can
Hmm.
agree on, though, are men self-report at doing, I think, half as much childcare.
Yeah, so it ends up being about a third in total. Yeah, no, I agreed. Yeah. So I think like
Yes.
in like 1965, it was like 20% of childcare. 2016, according to Pew, it was like you say, a half of what women do, 8 hours versus their 14, so about 35%. And that tends to be what nationally the amount of custody time men are getting, right? So the amount of time that they self-report that they do in marriage is the amount of custody time they get walking out of court. So that seems to me, if we're looking at a court that is most generally guided by status quo, guided by this idea that we want to maintain, the normalcy of the home and not upend things and that's in the best interest of the child, then it would seem, based off that data, that that is what we're seeing courts do. They are maintaining the status quo. And so any result of men not getting the custody they want is more a factor of them not doing the custody they should be doing in marriage and beforehand of being as involved parents, rather than a judicial bias or any issues of, they have to agree in custody decisions to less custody than they would like.
So I would also argue, because I knew you would bring this up, is that the one third of how much essentially that men
Yeah,
report to the child care is how much they are then getting when the custody that they ask for is granted, which is, maybe only half the time that they're even asking for it. And my argument would be that we also both agree that the majority of men do not request custody. And so therefore, I think that it can be established that the men who are requesting custody are not the majority of men. So there's
sure.
probably a huge subsector of those men who were the primary care providers, who are not employed, who do have the time to graciously offer these kids, and yet they're being lumped in with the grand majority of men unfairly. So I would say that that is kind of something that might require more examination.
No, I think we can say, for instance, right? Like we can both acknowledge, like, and I'm not pushing you down this, but we could say, even if we walk out of this saying that there is no bias against fathers and it is maintaining that status quo as the stats look, right? That there are still cases of men who would like to be more involved that do not get the custody that they would like. Absolutely. And it could be that they, through no fault of their own, these could be great guys who faced a contentious custody hearing and things didn't go their way. They got didn't like the look of them or had a crappy Tuesday. Like, absolutely, those cases can and do exist, right? I think it's clear that we want to put out there that those cases do. I want us to, though, like, just make sure, like you were talking there and saying, well, even if the majority, right, there is still these exceptions. Absolutely, but I would say, it's not the majority of cases, it is those exceptions. And when you say, we know this because, like, again, looking at Pew data, when they self-survey men, something like 60, I think it's 63% of men in a Pew survey. I'm going to look to my notes because I want to make sure I get that right. Yeah, in
Okay.
2017, 63% of men said they spent too little time with their kids, right? So almost two-thirds of men don't think that they spend enough time with their kids. But when they ask them why, two-thirds of them, well, 60% of them said it was because of work obligations.
Hmm.
It's not necessarily that they don't have them. Only 20% of them said it was down to not physically living with their kid that caused them to not have enough time. 1 in 5. So for men, they're self-reporting that the limitation for them spending time with their kids is the number of physical hours in the day because they are working. It is not necessarily by a course system or not having physical access to their kids.
Mm. I will say this, like I said, before I get into the next part, it's just that the numbers don't really look great because we take those same self-reported studies, and while men are
Mm-hmm.
spending less time with their children than the mothers, we are seeing that by and large, the majority of them are still involved in the day-to-day lives at a lesser scale, right? But then when we look at the numbers of how many fathers actually retain custody and then how few of them, in my opinion, because I would say even 30% of active fathers requesting custody not getting it, it's a little bit too few for me. I feel like that's not reflective of the involvement the fathers are still having. I feel like they're still not getting nearly as much time as they had prior. But
So when you say they're not getting as much time as they had prior, based off what, right? So we know that they self-report how much time they're spending, and that looks even. So is it that you're saying that there are more like primary fathers who don't end up primary fathers? Because again, I think those numbers in court show that they're getting primary custodialship at higher numbers. In marriage, it's something dismal, like something like 5 or 10%, whereas we know that 20% of custodial parents are fathers. So we know that they're getting legal custody at greater numbers than they were in marriage, and we know that they're getting custody time about equal. So when you say you don't see that, like, help me. What number is it that you're looking at that shows that men are somehow lesser in divorce than they were in marriage?
well, so if we agree that when the majority of men are married, they're with their kid, they're spending, let's say, 33% of the time with the child, we also
Right.
have to imagine that this is the 33% or 31% of time that these fathers are being given their kid. That's only of the fathers who fought their asses off for that time. Now imagine all of the men who were spending all that time who didn't fight, again, because of how many lawyers are telling them not to, as well as other societal things. It's at that point you have to imagine that this 32% of time allocation is also cut. So that's
So
also where I can see
that 35% number is nationwide across all divorces. It's not those that go to court. That's across all men.
that's
And we talked
custodial
about
time
when
granted, though. You can't have
no,
custodial time.
that's physical. No, that's physical time. It's just
The
physical time that they
nationwide
spend with
survey
their
that you
child.
posted was
Hmm.
custodial time. That's what I'm referencing.
Which is that?
You had posted it in your video, and it actually had the map of all of the different like blue.
Yeah. The custody exchange survey. So that's a survey of hundreds of family law professionals from all over the country asking what is the physical amount of time that courts typically grant in your state to fathers. And the nationwide average that they came up with was about 35%. And so, like I said, that's across the board, right?
And I'm
Um,
saying, but that's custodial granted time. Now, if there's not custodial granted time, we have no idea how much or how little time these fathers are being granted. I can't assume that mothers are giving fathers more than 35% of the time if the very studies that you sent me are also concluding, reported by multiple lawyers and attorneys and judges, that mothers in mediation do not want to give equal custody to fathers. They do
we
not.
can I know, yeah, you brought up mediation, and I think we'll get into mediation in a second because I think it's important to understand how those people end up in mediation in the first place, right? Because mediation you do not go to when it's uncontested. But if you're saying that that's only 35% of the contested cases, then how come even like in the contested cases, like we just talked about, men who ask for custody getting it 50% of the time, that's not 35% either. Like where is that 35% number coming from? Because the vast majority of those contested cases again result in joint and unequal parenting, over 40%. So even there, like that is showing that that would be a higher number than 35. The only way you get to 35% is if you include those contested cases where, 60% of the time mom is asking for sole custody, 60 to 70% of the time she's getting it, right? That's what skews that number down to because the leading states are all like 50-50 and don't grant 50-50 typically in contested states, in contested custody cases. Contested custody hearings have a far fewer percentage of 50-50 and joint custody evaluations because there usually are other influences into that. That's why it's contested in the first place, right? Usually there is some allegation of abuse or violence or something like that to get to a contested state. So that's why that 30% number, that number gets pulled down to 35%. So I don't think it's true to say that those are the only ones that go through and are contested.
So the reason I'm saying that is because there wouldn't really be a metric available. You know what? No, never mind. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying now. You're saying that the 35% of self-reported is uncontested, and that's reliable. 35% of custodial established time. I see what you're saying. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the Maryland gender bias study that you sent me.
Which one? Maryland, did you say?
Yeah, so a couple of these indicate you used these as studies that prove that there is not bias against fathers. However, so
you found the survey.
Gender bias, you cited the Maryland gender bias study as saying that 85% of judges said that fathers get a fair and serious hearing as a reason for there not being bias. But my question is, why would it not be 100%? If only 85% of judges, if 15% of judges are straight up saying this is not a fair and serious hearing, how is that not evidence of bias?
So the question itself is a leading question, right? Are men getting a fair hearing? And you say yes or no, right? A system that produces 100% of that is very unlikely because there are going to be instances where men maybe get an unfair hearing. Maybe he self-represented and he should have used an attorney. Or maybe he, messed up his case to court and didn't get a fair hearing for that. We don't know the answer to why.
Serious hearing.
But I'm saying we don't know why, right, of the 15. And we're making an assumption there that the 15 there is because they didn't get a fair hearing because, well, it's because I was biased. I don't think a judge is going to self-admit that the reason they didn't get a hearing is because I'm biased.
But they did, because that report also stated many judges and lawyers reported to the committee that they share the belief of some litigants that mothers are preferred in custody disputes. So
they did. And then right after that section, and so I did a whole video on this because that is one part of that first introduction where they said that. And then right after, they then said that men get a fair hearing and that the reason for this incongruence between those two statements is because of, likely, men are told and not encouraged to go to court, and that specifically it states, not because of judicial bias.
But then the findings also list some judges believe that men are unfit for custody because of their sex and that men should not become too involved with their children. It then clearly states here in that study, these biased attitudes disadvantage men.
They do. And it also says right after, some judges believe women are unfit for custody if they engage in sexual conduct, are economically inferior to the father, work outside the home, or do not fulfill the judge's conception of a perfect mother. These biases disadvantage women. Men's violence towards women is insufficient decisions. So overwhelmingly, the bias is against women, and they point that out in the study. So no, you're right. They do conclude that there are instances where there are bias against them, but they also conclude that overwhelmingly and disproportionately, it affects mothers more than fathers.
I'm not understanding fully how it can be determined that it's so disproportionate when we're agreeing that when fathers fight their asses off for custody, there's like 30% of them not even getting it. When we want to talk disproportionate, that's not even remotely close to how often women lose custody. I would say it's probably less than 10% of women who ever lose custody, probably far number lower than 10% who ever lose custody. Whereas we have
That's not even true.
probably well over 30% of men who can't even gain it when they ask for it.
So it's absolutely not true that women only lose custody about 10% of the cases. They don't even get that kind of good treatment when there is when there's claims of abuse. So we know that that's not true because women will actually lose custody at far greater rates when they claim abuse. So we know that they're not losing custody at 10%. That's not true.
But what you just said is very interesting because you're saying when they claim abuse, but you're not saying when the abuse is corroborated in any way. And
because it doesn't need to be. Even if the abuse is not corroborated, women lose custody at about a quarter of the rate, about 25% of the time. If you have sole custody and you allege abuse, you will lose that custody about 25% of the time. That is from Mayer's 2020 study of national cases. They looked at about 15,000 custody studies where abuse was claimed. They went through about 4,000 of them, and here we go. Women who allege abuse, particularly child abuse, by a father are at significant risk, 1 in 4, of losing custody to the alleged abuser. Even if the courts find that the fathers have abused the children and they uphold those claims of abuse, they still award the fathers sole custody 13% of the time, so 1 in 8. So women lose custody at greater than 10%, even if the father has been proven to be abusive. Now, this is why it's a struggle to say that there are these judicial biases against men, because they win at such high numbers even when there's abuse. And if they allege alienation back, right, and this is what I was going to talk about with the mediation, right, a lot of those mediation cases are unfortunately domestic violence, and most states do not allow you to do mediation for domestic violence, but still there is an exceptionally high rate of cases that go to mediation with domestic violence. But I forgot where I was going right off that way. But if the men actually allege alienation back towards the mother, they can actually lose custody at like 4 times the rate. So if she alleges abuse, he says she's turning the kid against me. The courts actually are almost 4 times more likely to disbelieve mother's claims of abuse and turn over the custody to the father. Like, this is where, like, these are the exceptions, I'll grant you, right? Like, whenever abuse is alleged, it's a smaller number of cases. It's still quite high. I think it's about 13-14%, something like that. But when that happens, like, men still win in these shockingly high numbers. And if there was this kind of bias against men, that men are unfit, like that fathers are generally unfit to do it, there wouldn't be this. But unfortunately, the reality is that these court cases disbelieve women at far higher rates than they disbelieve men, and that ultimately results in men getting way more custody.
Now, I will agree that the findings of which domestic violence is weirdly ignored in court is definitely pretty high on both ends, between all genders and sexes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it is kind of abysmally ignored, and that is definitely a massive issue.
One of the shocking things to me, and like doing and prepping for this discussion with you, was the fact that I did not know this, right, coming into this, and this just got me, was that there are actually higher rates of domestic violence in divorce cases. Like, there are higher cases of police reports or restraining orders than are referred in the courts. So it's about half the rate. So there's actually, whatever rate it is that divorce cases mention there's a history of domestic violence, the reality is it's actually double, and people are encouraged not to mention it in court. And I think, if we talk about court reform, that's one that's got to change, right? Because we know that somebody who's abusive, mother or father, if they're abusive towards the spouse, it is more than likely going to transfer to the child as well, or they're going to continue to keep going on and escalate that abuse. So the fact that 50% of that abuse doesn't even come up in these custody hearings, I mean, that's definitely, I think, something that needs to change.
Yeah, and And here's the thing, one thing I want to bring up without doing any disservice to any victims of domestic violence is that there has been a lot of research put into the fact that during child custody disputes, allegations of abuse tend to go up more so.
Yeah, no, it's used as a it's used as a tool, unfortunately. Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is because of the bias structures that exist. If these court models went more off of what I'm suggesting, which is we presume that both parents are fit, and as long as you can present your plan, you can get the custody. And we definitely consider domestic violence. We definitely do that.
Sure.
But in the current models that are set up, I think that it's more encouraged to use these weapons and tools. And this is where we're getting more false allegations, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think it's about 40%. I'm looking here now again at my notes. 46% of cases of allegations of abuse are supported. So it's less than half, right? So I mean, it's about half, but it's about that. And yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately used at that. But I would also say that same study that looked at that and examined how often abuse is claimed also found that it was more frequently claimed by fathers than it was by mothers, 36 to 51. So
it's interesting. I found a lot that say the opposite, that it's and I could definitely link a lot of these studies because I have a whole page, but there was like four.
You talk about like sending me some links. I love to like read up on this stuff, and especially like to see the stuff where I learn more from from it, because I don't know everything, right? And I'm not a lawyer. I don't look through court. This is just something I do, to read. So like, I absolutely don't know everything. But yeah, I mean, but honestly, just it's heartbreaking that it's that high, right? That they're, even if it is only 13% of, or like 15%, 13 around that of cases that involve abuse, right? That half of them are supported, and the other fact is that they estimate, what was this, like the Leadership Council or whatever used that statistic, whatever, like 58,000 children every year are given unsupervised visitation with their abuser. Like, that's a horrible statistic as well. Like, that shouldn't happen.
Well, so okay, here's the challenging part, though. This is where it gets really difficult, because I'm so with you in that I do not know the best, most perfect answer for
Agreed.
When abuse is alleged. What do you do? And I actually put out a poll to my audience, and I said, hey, what do you think should happen to a custody situation when abuse is alleged? And I would say the majority of people voted that they should still have supervised visitation, with the second highest vote being that it should be completely cut off. And I will say I'm inclined to agree with supervised visitation until the investigation is concluded. I am inclined that way.
As a father, I don't know how comfortable I would be with that. Like, if you were sharing custody with somebody, right? Forget the court case, forget any of all of that. But if you had an abusive partner, knowing what they've done to you, would you be okay with supervised visitation with their child? And I would struggle with that, honestly.
Yeah, and I mean, you never know until you're put in that position. But at the same time, I'm compelled to think about all of the people who, if it was in a situation, if people, any person, mother or father, knew that the moment they make an accusation, their child goes into their custody, they no longer see the other parent, that tool would be abused on both sides. Do you know what I mean?
Right, but I think we just talked about that it is being abused by both sides to do that, right? And that even when it is, like you still get high levels of custody. Like I said, something like 70% of those alleged of abuse still get some form of unsupervised visitation with their children. So alleging abuse is not an I win button. It does not remove custody from the other parent. We just talked about how if a mother with sole custody alleges abuse, she's incredibly likely to lose custody of that child. A quarter of them will lose custody of that child just simply for alleging abuse. And if it's child abuse, that number actually goes up to 50%. So you're running 50-50 odds. So if you think that like, oh, I'm going to accuse the father of these horrible things and I'm going to get custody, you're rolling the dice because 50-50, you're not. 50-50, he's going to get sole custody. And they do that because the courts decide that because you're making these accusations, you're no longer an agreeable parent and you're no longer going to be willing to co-parent. And they are so biased wanting amicable joint custody decisions because they know that those typically keep them out of court, right? Sole custody decisions are relitigated way more than either like unequal joint custody or joint custody because people tend to be happy with that and just live with it. Even if it's not maybe the custody they want, it's something they can live with. So
you're saying joint custody is what they want, or sole custody is unlitigated. Sorry.
So I'm saying that judges prefer joint custody decisions because they're less likely to see those people back in court, right? Okay, judges do not want to relitigate this stuff, and they know that even if the parents are unhappy with that decision, it's going to keep them from trying to change the order or relitigate. So because of that, if a parent is shown to be, disagreeable and accusing the other parent of abuse, they're actually more likely to give that parent sole custody or the primary custodialship and have them work out the details of that joint custody because they say, oh, that other parent, they're disagreeable, they're not doing it. And this is why so many of those cases of abuse are discouraged. Like legal professionals will counsel their clients and say, don't bring up abuse. Don't bring up any claims of it. Even if you have proof, even if you've got police records, don't mention it because of this factor that judges will go, okay, they're being disagreeable, I'm going to assign sole custody over to the other, or primary custody over to the other parent. And that's, not putting the child's interests at heart at all. And especially since, there are a lot of studies that show in those cases where abuse is alleged and there is alleged abuse proven, that abuse continues in something like 70 to 80% of those cases. So we know that like those quarter or half of cases where that custody flips over to the father, and I say the father, but look, there's instances where it flips to the mother and she's abusive, right? Like, let's be clear that abuse is not a gendered thing. Those judges are knowing that in leaning into this bias of I want to prefer joint custody, they're signing those kids up for more abuse, and it's just unacceptable, I think.
I'm so very torn on it. Because in one circumstance, I feel so passionately about making sure these children are pulled out of domestic violence situations, but at the same time, there really is a disgusting amount of research that seems to indicate that during child custody proceedings, allegations of abuse, allegations of false abuse just seem to skyrocket. And so there is a part of me, when I hear that there is a bit of scrutiny put on people for choosing to make these accusations during child custody proceedings, there's a part of me that's kind of like, well, good. This should be scrutinized and fully investigated. But I just don't know the perfect situation, because I definitely feel that as soon as an accusation is made, the steps to correct that need to start happening immediately. I just don't know if the best answer is completely no contact anymore with the accused. I would hope that a child could be protected enough under a supervised visitation to conclude the findings, where what did we agree on? That like in these cases, it was the numbers that I have.
Sure, you just go.
Let's see. Sorry, I have a good few pages here.
Good. I love it.
Where are we with this stuff? Hold on.
Yeah, no worries. Take a water break.
Yeah. There was a few that I think the average between most of these studies is that 30% of them are completely proven false. And the other, I think it's like only 23% of them were concretely proven, and the rest were unfounded or 30% demonstrably false. And that is so much to where I would just take highly into consideration the fact that it would be really dangerous to fully cut off contact every single time an accusation is made based off of these percentages.
So I think, yeah, I mean, I struggle with that, right? Because I mean, it's a balancing act, right? What we're trying to say is, on the one hand, there's a risk to exposing this child to an abusive person who may abuse them, who may continue advance, or even may expose them to violence through having, just having I don't know what the word is. There's a word for it, but like when you have a contentious co-parenting situation, right? That they're high conflict.
I was going to say high
right?
conflict.
That you're going to expose them. I've experienced that through somebody else, not my own. We have a very amicable relationship, but I've experienced that, right? There was somebody in my life who ended up having a knockout, drag-out fight in a McDonald's parking lot as they were exchanging custody of the kids. Like, that's not healthy to expose those kids to. So, but like, that's the risk on one side. The risk on the other side is that, they don't have that abusive person in their life. And I think, to me, that scale is got to be on the side of protecting the kid over protecting the parental right. I think where you're talking about we need to make sure we investigate those claims and we make sure that if we are going to do that, that we can be sure that happens. I think right now that scale is so far on the other side, right? If 70% of kids end up with somebody who has proven to be abusive and 80% of the time they continue that abuse, that's not what's going on right now is definitely too far the other way than protecting the kids, I think.
Where is the 70% coming from? Because I remember, is this coming from that Saunders report that someone commented on? Because someone commented on your status and said something about 70% of abusers gain custody of the children, but I could not. They cited the Saunders report as part of that, but when I look up the Saunders report, it very clearly stated that they do not have the numbers to support that abusers concretely get custody one way or another.
Well, I think there was one study that, I don't want to get into the Saunders report because I'm not pulling the numbers from there or defending it, but yeah, there's one study that came out and kind of disputed the numbers in Saunders' study, but it's important to point out that that study that did Saunders, much like the one you talked about from Mark Rosenthal on the Massachusetts study, also not a peer-reviewed study.
No, I'm not talking about the response. In the Saunders report itself, it said there wasn't the numbers.
But no, so I did a video on this a little while back, and there is a whole organization that looks into this, and they had a whole list, and I can absolutely send you this afterwards, of studies from all across, I think Canada and the US throughout the 70s and the 80s that all supported this number from anywhere from 60 to 80% of abusers got custody of their child. And remember, when I was talking before about when mothers with sole custody abuse fathers and it gets flipped to the father 25% of the time, that's only sole custody. When we talk about any form of unsupervised custody with the child, it's much higher. I don't know, looking through my list, I don't know if that broke it out as to what they got in terms of everything. I don't think it does. But yeah, it's much higher than that 20 or 50%. So we know that it's got to be in that region in there. But I will absolutely send you the link of all of those studies that kind of back that number. It's definitely not something I'm pulling out. And again, the Leadership Council's little article all about it showed that as well. That may have been from Saunders' number, but I don't remember. I don't have Saunders in here, I don't think.
I know that one was kind of.
That's a good call out.
That would be a lot for me to expect you to. The whole study was a lot. I did not read that. But okay, so here's another thing I want to bring up too, though. So in regards to one thing that I personally feel demonstrably proves that there is a gender bias within family court is the fact that we can demonstrably prove that there is gender bias against men in general as far as sentencing disparity goes, right? We have
Okay.
tons of statistics on this that indicate by and large that sentencing, fines for women to men under the exact same crimes, even when looking at controlling factors such as the severity of the crime or history of past crimes, and these are studies led by women, it tends to find that there is an intense bias against men in the courtroom. And so why would we assume that this sentencing disparity would suddenly vanish in family court when it's so pervasive in every other courtroom?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And I think the first thing I would say is, well, they're not similar, right? The sentencing disparity for against men and women in court isn't the same for is in family court. Because I can easily turn around and say, okay, when we look at cases of, SA or DV, we see that disparity flip around completely, right? Women are often dismissed as victims. They don't get the treatment they're talked about. I did a whole video this week of just how those crimes are just treated as trivial now. And these are some of the most egregious, violent crimes. And yet, court systems both here in the US and the UK treat them as completely trivial. So we see a massive gender bias against women in courts too. So I guess the question would be, why are we picking only one sort of gender bias in courts and using that to prescribe to family courts rather than the other? And the second thing I would say as to why we can be confident that this doesn't show up in family court is because of those state studies that I talked about, right? The ones that I gave you in the video, I think there was about 5 of them, right? The whole list is somewhere over, I think it's 30 something, right? Of all of these state studies. I'm not going to read out the list because it will take me, I've timed it, it takes about 5 minutes. But as a summary, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Nevada, Massachusetts, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, Washington, Colorado, Florida, Illinois, New Mexico, Utah, Connecticut, Georgia, Vermont, Wisconsin, District of Columbia, Idaho, Kentucky, Louisiana, Iowa, Missouri, Texas, Delaware. What else we got? Alaska, California, North Dakota, Maine, Virginia, Pennsylvania. All of those states have done extensive, multi-year long studies into family courts, into their court bias, and those results are almost identical across those states, right? Those studies have been published from 1984 through to 2001. So that's about 15 of the 18-year period. 32 studies from 32 states over 15 of those 18 years. So across that 18-year gap, almost every year, one state, at least one state, was publishing a study into deep research on family court bias. That's how we get to effectively say we can be fairly confident that that same does not exist there, because the level of evidence and study that has been done on these family courts is so extensive.
Which is the one that you're citing for this? Because these all came from.
This is all of. No, this is not one that I'm citing. This is the list of state task force that that did a study. So there's 32 that I could find. I think there's more. I believe there's 40. So I'm missing 8. But these are the only ones that I could find and get and read. Not all of them are public available. I think most are. But I will send you the list. But that 32 list of states is all of the states that commissioned a state-run task force or used the state bar association to commission a deep study into gender bias in the court system. And each of those specifically addressed gender bias in family courts.
Yeah, I'd be curious to take a look at these because I had a difficult time with a lot of these as I tried to bring up every
Yeah,
one.
and I think
Like
you'd
some of them
mentioned
are
that.
as vague as like the most that they give is like a simple one sentence, like not even a good metric. It'll say something like, oh, fathers were more likely to get it if they asked for it, or something very vague. And I'm like, what does that sentence even mean? Yeah, it says this one,
Right.
the Supreme Court Florida Gender Bias Study all that one
Hmm.
says is that it indicates that men requesting custody are largely successful. That's not a metric I can use,
Sure,
like,
but you have
fairly.
to not just right. Okay, so but you have to look not just at the study itself. You also have to look at because I think somebody in my comments showed up today to make this claim as well. They were like, the Florida one doesn't even show you the data that it uses, and I was like, it calls it out. I'm gonna just bring it up in a second. But so the the Florida study was done over multiple years. It looked at every single case from I think when was Florida's done? From like a 2 year or from a 6 month period. It looked at every case from January 1989 to June. Sorry, I'm trying to pull this from memory because I'm struggling to pull it up. It looked at every piece of literature that was published that was relevant in the area. It looked at, I think, a half dozen studies. There's like 3 pages in the initial introduction, pages 9, 10, and 11, that list out where it's pulling all of its data from. So, yes, the conclusion might be a couple of sentences, but it's done that based off a legal review of all of these cases, of all of this documentation, to do that by legal professionals. So I think that's what we need to keep in mind, right? Like, yes, it doesn't work great for us pulling quotes out and being able to pull like a great killer stat to like, oh, I got it. But instead, we need to look at these are multi-year long studies done by legal professionals based on a huge swath of data, and that's what they come up with. Now, question could be asked: how closely did they look at the data? You know, did a junior
Right.
clerk fill that in on a Friday night at 5 p.m. Or
And I don't
did they
want to
take
cherry
weeks
pick.
away? I don't
I
know.
hate when
Yeah,
people like move the goalposts and try and be like, oh, well, okay, so you did find a study that shows that men get custody 70% of the time. Well, what does it say about that? And then, keep moving it. I don't want to be that person, but I will say
sure.
that in the ones that I've really looked at, and every single one that I've really looked at, even when they seem to indicate that there is a pretty higher than majority odds that when a man requests custody, he gets it, there are
Hmm.
still in almost every single study evidence of gender bias. For example, the Supreme Court Florida gender bias study indicates non-custodial fathers are disadvantaged in the allotment of visitation, and that because some courts use a standardized visitation schedule regardless of the circumstances or the employment situation of the parties, this results in discrimination against men. So it's interesting how almost every single one of these things that I found supports both of us.
That's from the Florida one.
The Florida one, yeah, the Supreme Court Florida gender bias study ends up saying
Okay, there we go.
some courts use a standardized visitation schedule. This is in the findings
Hmm.
section, actually, um,
Yeah,
resulting in discrimination against men.
sure, but I think that's just saying that it's used as a standardized visitation schedule. I mean, that's not necessarily saying that men are being biased against. It's not showing that they're being
Yes, though,
discriminated
literally,
against.
that's a quote. That's not me saying resulting in discrimination against men. That's what the findings literally say verbatim.
Right, but I'm saying it's saying that it's doing that based off of using a standard visitation schedule. So maybe the visitation schedule needs to be updated or things like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a judicial bias, does it?
This is something I feel like you'll agree with me though, and this is something that I actually hate
Okay.
about standard visitation schedules is what is standard visitation? One dinner a week and every other weekend. This is screwing over mothers because moms are so sick of constantly.
Yes, not being the weekend parent. Oh God, yes.
Yes, yes,
No,
like
agreed.
so sick of being like shoehorned into these
Mm.
roles of like, well, we just assume you're better, so you do all the responsibility, and he'll give you some modicum of money to help you with all this labor. And every other weekend is just giving dads this ability to just be the fun parent. It's
I,
not equitable.
I don't mind being the fun parent. No, and
But they
I
push
think no,
that
but that's
no.
a huge part of the problem in those. But I would say this, right, on those standard visitation schedules, not a single state that I could see, and I hate using absolute statements because the minute you use an absolute statement, somebody's like puts on the glasses and they're like, well, actually, right? But so far that, to my knowledge, to the best of my knowledge, that is flawed and terrible. Not a single state awards custody at a level below the standard visitation. I think the worst one is Tennessee, and it still awards at like 23%, which is well above like the 13% that you get on that standard visitation with the weekends. So even if we say like, oh, those standard visitations are screwing over dads because they get to be the weekend dads, absolutely. But most courts are still awarding custody at higher levels. Like here in Texas, again, we use that standard weekend visitation schedule, 13%. The average that we're assigning is somewhere in the 30s, I think 33, 35%, something like that, which is showing that about 50% of the time, men are getting 50-50 custody around that. To be able to pull that 13% up to 35, about half the time men are getting, 50-50 or roughly custody to be able to pull that number up. So yeah, I mean, agreed. The standard visitations are terrible, and I think it's a great argument to saying why we should be encouraging men to go into court asking for better than visitation. The default 13%, they should be going in asking, if they can for 50-50 or like a 3-4 or something, whatever works well that you can work out with that co-parent and go through it. Because yeah, the default visitation are garbage, but a lot of men comment how they didn't even know or aware that they could ask for more. They thought they have to get a lawyer and go work it out and spend all this money on legal fees. They weren't even aware that you can just turn up on your day in court and say, hey, we've come up with this, but actually I would like this. And oftentimes, if there is no issues and you've shown experience of being an involved father, the judge will just say, okay, we're going to put a pin in this hearing. You guys are going to come back. Here's what I recommend we do. Or they may override your order right then and there and put it through. It depends, right? But that is definitely an option that's open to fathers, and I would encourage them to look into that. Even if you don't want to spend the fees on getting a lawyer, know that you can on your day in court just ask.
Absolutely. And that's like definitely the area that you and I are just in 100% agreement on, because it could be that we find out tomorrow that someone comes out and says, you know what, as it turns out, dads actually get custody every time or it comes out and it's like abysmal, right? And it comes out and
Sure.
it's like, actually dads, you only get like 10% chance. You're probably not going to get it. Even if the worst case scenario came out, I would still encourage fathers to request custody. And but this is also where the gender bias comes in, is I feel like there just not enough resources available to men compared to women. And I base this in the fact that we find that men receive state assistance at like 25% the rate that women do. I just don't think that men have enough resources to fully realize that they can request custody on their own. But
Yeah.
I do believe that there's still a bias against when you represent yourself pro se. That's where it gets tricky. Definitely still do it, but there's bias.
But that's like my issue with this whole conversation, right? Like, you talk about like the Florida report, right? And saying, hey, look, I'm going to look at this line about non-custodial fathers are disadvantaged and that they don't get the standard visitation. Right before that, though, Lauren, what it says is, contrary to public perception, men are quite successful in obtaining residential custody of their children, that they actually seek it. And that sums up like my whole frustration with this discussion, right? We're taking a report from Florida that says men are actively discouraged, they are successful when they seek it, and instead of blasting that from the rooftops, we're taking the line underneath that says, the standard schedule kind of screws men over. Yeah, agreed, but like that shouldn't be the headline. The headline should be men are successful when they seek it. And I think that's really the message we want to take out of this, of those gender bias studies, is that they're on these overwhelming hurdles. It's not to say, and I know a lot of the people who are your audience, right, have horrible stories, right, of, hey, injustice was done to me. And it's not to diminish any of those stories to say there are not supreme barriers. It is all about simply saying men need to show up more. And it's not just about showing up in court. It is about showing up from the moment that child is born, because the more active you are as a father in that child's life, the better your chances are going to be, not be divorce court, never you ever wish to go through custody, because even as somebody who had probably one of the most amicable divorces, it was painful, it was horrible on both sides. Like, it's not a fun experience. You do not want to go through it. But if that were to happen, you've put yourself in an excellent position to be a continuing factor and a strong influence in that child's life by doing so beforehand. And I think the issue is just more this idea that you work, you try to uphold a family, you think that you're doing the right thing by, I'm just going to go out and I'm going to work all the hours and I'm going to make all the money. And then that happens and you're suddenly like, oh, well, I want to be an involved dad. And the courts are just looking at that status quo and saying, dude, you had all the time in the world to be an involved dad. And you're like, but I was working. And they're going to turn around to you and say, but you're still going to be working, right? You're not getting more hours after the divorce. So the chances of you, if you weren't able to make 50-50 work beforehand, the chances of you being able to make it work afterwards are no better. We don't see a good reason to side and move that child into a 50-50 situation based off that. Because that's heartbreaking, right? If you get to that position, you're like, okay, now I want to be around and be involved for that child. It's knowing that you've really got to figure out how to make it work. And it sucks. As somebody who was, the breadwinner and also trying to be involved in my life, like coming home at 5, you get a bit of dinner, you put your kids down for play with them for a couple of hours, you put the kids down, you maybe get 30 minutes, an hour to yourself. Like, it sucks. I get it because it's hard, but as hard as it is, you need to show up and put them first.
Exactly. And I think on the other side of that coin, as much as it's so important for, you to be sharing your message and your point with my audience and to say, like, guys, you really do have more of a chance than you've been led to believe. There are actively people out there selling you this story that you don't have a chance, and in reality you do, and you should be there. And I think that that is such an important message. On the other side of this coin, one of the reasons that I want to clarify that there is still bias against men is because sometimes these talking points are used to really minimize these issues that men are going through and to kind of dilute down the very real problems they have. So, for example, we do have enough evidence from these studies to indicate that even when a father showcases, hey, I've actually been the stay-at-home dad and, I work just a few hours from home and I can be the primary care parent, they're more likely to just follow a standardized visitation schedule because that's just easier to defer to within the courts. And there are a lot of dads who want to complain about stuff like this and are constantly being told, shut up, women's problems are worse. You guys really don't have it that bad. That's kind of a lot of why I like to talk about these issues. But if it were not for being challenged by other creators like yourself, it would be really easy for me to take that stance and then just become another black pilled out dude who's like, there's no
sure.
Anyway, so why bother women? They're not worth dating. And I don't want to do that.
Sure. So I would disagree that those who put in the effort and are so fathers don't get it. I mean, again, all of the studies are pretty clear that when men seek custody and request sole custody, they get it at high rates. And I've not seen any really that show they don't get it at those high rates when they request it. I think, again, it's 70% across the board. I was looking at, I'm trying to find it in my list. It's always bad when somebody's like, oh, I looked at a study and then they can't tell you what it is. But I was looking at a study today that was looking at, I think it was Nebraska. Yeah, it was Nebraska. From data from 2002 to 2012, right? And it showed that I think men only saw custody. Yeah, sole custody in the father was only saw 15% of the time, but their win rate was 13%, right, of the total. So their win rate's almost 90%. If they're going for it, they're going for it. But I would say that the reason for that is because typically they're not going to push for sole custody unless there are problems with the other parent, right? And so that's why men's win rate is high, is because the chances of them going to go seek sole custody is because there is something else going on. Otherwise, they're probably going to just, deal with an agreed custody settlement that doesn't go through the courts. But on this whole thing of all right, men's issues get minimized and all the rest of it. My issue is we could have this discussion without mentioning women at all. And I think that's been my whole argument through all of this, right? Has been, look, it's agreed, men should get more custody, and I think it's in men's power to be able to do this and to fix this problem and go for it. When we have this conversation, I think the frustration is that it's very rarely done without it being and women are trash, and my ex is keeping me from the kids, and she's accusing me of all these false things and all of this, and it becomes this, you said black pill, but I would say like more red pill talking point. And I think you mentioned in like your response to me and to Destiny that like you get accused of repeating red pill points, and it's like that's not who you are. It's not who you want to be. It's definitely not the message you're trying to put out there, right? But in my response, I showed you how the very study that you, or not study, but the very article you were looking at, right, was an article from a deeply misogynistic author who wasn't a specialist in the field. He's a software engineer like me, right? And that, he had been an advocate for a voice for men and spoke at their conference. And so I think the danger is whether that's your intent or not, right? Whether you want to push that kind of narrative or talk about it, when you take that article from somebody who has a very red pill point and you advocate those same views, right? What may not be known to you is those are the same talking points in a lot of those heavily misogynistic circles. So when they see Lauren saying the same thing, it's like, yeah, she's on our side, one of us. And then it becomes, right, a snowball effect of like, oh, hey guys, like Lauren's on our side, Lauren's, pushing this message. And then that's when we see like, just interacting with your audience, a lot of men coming into my comments and being like, women are trash, women are horrible, and all the rest of it. I don't want to mention it by name, but there was one particular guy who has just, his whole thing has just been to insult, demean, and degrade me for supporting women, right? And that's his whole thing, is like, you have to be trash because you support women. And I think that's where that comes from, I think, Lauren, is it's not necessarily that there is a minimization of men's issues. It's that I think a lot of these talking points that get repeated come from those very misogynistic people, and that's why we have to be very, very careful.
I think it's both. I think that we have a big misogyny problem, and I think we have a big misinjury problem, because really, in this whole discussion, at no point in time had I brought up women or attempted to minimize the issues that women face. And yet in bringing up the gender biases that are against men, which was the only point that I was trying to make, that there are biases against men, you've continuously brought up the fact that like, but women are more biased, and then once again turning into a competition, which minimizes the fact that we can still establish their gender biases.
Well, it's not necessarily a competition. It's more pointing out that when we look at those studies to say, oh, they have mentioned, a bias against men. Great, they've mentioned a bias against men. They mentioned an overwhelming bias against women. And so if we're going to talk about how custody decisions are affected by that bias, they're more disproportionately affecting and creating negative outcomes for women who want to seek employment, or women who have an extrasexual partner. Like, they get punished and penalized at far greater rates in terms of custody than men do. So if we're going to say like, oh, there's bias, then we have to show that that bias is far greater than the one that is losing custody from women, to show that it is disadvantaging men. To say that men might be disadvantaged in some situations, but not as greatly as women, is again to center the issue around the men and ignore the bigger gist of the problem. And again, like, it's very hard to make a claim that men's issues are being ignored or that men are being minimized if the whole argument is, I'm going to completely ignore the greater suffering of other people to only focus on a disadvantage that men face.
It's
tough though. It's tough, but I understand, right? Like, as a man, I totally understand, right? Because again, it's not to say that men's issues aren't, a struggle to talk about. Like, even on my page, right, talking about men's issues, I know that like the engagement level talking about men's mental health or talking directly to men and talking to them is far lower, because men were more likely to just put it on our shoulders and stuff it through. And that's a huge problem that we men have to address amongst ourselves and talk about the fact that we are so reluctant to seek help. We are so reluctant to openly talk and be vulnerable about the stress decisions we go through. And things like trying to be a father, trying to be a breadwinner, trying to like work all the hours, and then try to be a partner and to fit all of that into the hours in the day, it's tough, right? It's tough for moms too, but it's tough on us. And then you have to do that as well, being the strength for your rest of your family. Like, I've felt that. I've felt that whole feeling of, I think in Lord of the Rings he talks about how he feels like too little butter spread over too much bread. You know, like there's just not enough of you to go around. Like I can absolutely relate to that and that struggle and that feeling of, where is my advocate? Where is the person who is there for me and my strength? Absolutely.
So, yeah, now I guess one other question that I would ask, because we're talking now about the disproportion between how men and women are treated in family court. So then how do you feel about the fact that proportionately there are far more men in jail and with suspended license due to delinquent child support than women for the exact same amount of delinquent child support? And the fact that custodial interference is not even remotely addressed the same way as delinquent child support.
I think child support is a huge issue, right? Again, a lot of those gender bias studies brought up the fact that a lot of custody cases would be brought up, and child support was used as an issue. Unfortunately, this was predominantly men, and I know I'm going on about men, but like I will come to the other side of this, where they would bring up and use custody as a means to get a more advantaged financial situation. I think the Florida one brought that up. I believe Nebraska or Wisconsin brought that up as well. But like, this is a common thing. And I think that's completely wrong, right? Like, trying to use custody of your kids to manipulate your child support situation to try to get a better financial advantage in it is absolutely unacceptable. Flip side of that, though, I think a situation where if you are absolutely unable to pay child support, right, one of the things is if you lose your job, right, you're still garnished at a level of what your expected income could be. And if that unemployment lasts for a length of time and you end up in jail because of that, that is a problem. But I think that is a much bigger problem about like the US prison system, debt across the board. Debtors' prisons are a huge problem. The fact that you can essentially be wealthy and to avoid jail, but if you're poor and you cannot pay parking tickets or other fines, and you go to jail for that, and then that traps you into a cycle of you're going to more than likely go back into jail, and when you come out of jail, you're more likely to be homeless and unemployed, and it traps you into this vicious cycle. Absolutely. And I think I've talked about that before when addressing homelessness, that like, this is a huge problem, and that child support can be a feeder into that. Absolutely. But I think, we also show that, like, yes, I think a higher rate of mothers are delinquent on child support than fathers. But I think that overall is something that needs to be addressed, because I think, like the average child support payment, I think is somewhere around the region of $300-400 a month. And it could be hard. And especially if you are both living on the poverty level, right? A flat rate 20%, like here in Texas, or some of the other calculations, are definitely going to affect you more than, say, somebody who's earning six figures or more. It's much easier, it's more convenient for you to be able to pay it out. Like, I'm in a situation where made every single child support payment on time, never had a problem making my child support payments. And it's easy. If I was making 30 or 40 or 50 grand a year, that would be a much more difficult time. I think it's hard, but the reason that child support exists is because of the massive income disparity between men and women in divorce. Men are anywhere between 2 to 4 or even 5 times higher earners than the mothers after divorce. And I think there needs to be a way to address that. I don't know if child support as it stands now is the best way.
Can that really be true though? I thought it was. I thought that the wage median between spouses was getting very close. I don't think it's that dramatically different after divorce. 3-5 times different.
Yeah, I don't have anything to hand, so you're totally fine to call BS on that. I'm totally fine because I cannot pull it. But as going through and reading this, the numbers that I've seen have been like 2 to 4 times the income disparity, especially like that recent video I did about talking about like the statistic outcomes for men in jail, like the income disparity between father households and mother households is like 2 to 4. Large part of that is because, you know, women are more likely to be doing more childcare, get less advanced in their careers, stay at home moms. I've talked about like how that can cause anywhere up to like $500,000 worth of lost income, even on a median income, being at home for just 5 years. But it's also down to the fact that there is still, even though women are catching up in education, there's still an education gap that sometimes happens, especially in divorce cases where, you know, they have lower education, so that limits their income opportunities, and that just creates the problem. But yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was closer to like 50% of mothers are also working, contributing just as much. In fact, the rise of breadwinning mothers is
It's awesome, right? 20% of them. Let's go.
So
Let's go.
yeah,
Hey,
so I think
I'm all in like stay-at-home dad and having all of my bills paid by my partner. That sounds great. I will cook. I will clean. Absolutely.
I think a lot more men would. It's just that have you seen these studies, by the way, that they took what the average perception is of how much men should be contributing to the home, and it was very, very high. But then they took, you know, how much the average woman is earning, and the expectation of how much men should be contributing has stayed so high, so much higher above than what women should be expected to contribute, whereas women's actual ability to contribute has gone up pretty significantly. And so I think that plays a big role in whether or not men are afforded the societal privilege to be like assume that they can do it just as well as women can, which I think you would agree with.
Yeah, but I mean, like that all ties into like a huge conversation on how expensive childcare is, right? Because if we had affordable, accessible childcare, this would help solve a lot of the problem, right? Men could be more involved overnight if they had that, right? They wouldn't have to work as long and do as much because we'd have that, and you know their spouses would be able to share more of the load. It'd be able to do that. And I mean, you know, again, there's problems everywhere.
Now I'm curious too. Do you? This is a little bit off topic, but it kind of has to do with the gender bias that I believe exists. Do you believe that there should be license suspension and jail time for delinquent child support?
I think my struggle with it is what happens if you don't pay child support for a year. I was talking to somebody last week, and they were talking about how their child support payment was $200 a month, and their spouse got 10 grand in arrears, right? So you're looking 5 years in arrears. At that point, what do you do? And I think, you know, the question of it all comes up, like, child support has never really been a thing about making sure mothers get paid. Child support has always been a state thing, that they don't want to be paying more to the mom and, you know, in, what do we call it? Welfare. There we go. Paying more in welfare and social services. So they established child support as a means to cover that, so that the state isn't out of pocket. Because God knows we don't want to pay people and give people welfare. Oof, terrible ideas. What about this social security that, you know? And so that's where that comes from. And so it's more of a state punishment, right? They want to go after the fathers to put them in there to make sure that there isn't a spate of people, or not necessarily fathers, but fathers and mothers, not paying their child support because it puts undue pressure on the state. I don't know what an effective means of making sure that child is made whole, because the reality is that $10,000 is missing from the child. It's not missing from the mom. It's not missing from the state. It's missing from the child. How do you effectively encourage somebody who is not paying that child support to be able to pay it, to make sure that that child is getting what they need? And I think that's a difficult question. I agree with you. I don't know if suspending their license is a good idea, because if you can't drive, especially here in the US, how are you getting to your job?
Yeah, I'm super against it, and they actually have done studies, which I think that would lead to you forming a stronger opinion on this. They did do studies that proved that the suspending of the licenses, the jail time, did nothing to secure any more child support collection year over year. And I know Joe Biden, whatever you think of him, he has actually been pushing to eradicate license suspension for delinquent child support. And so I was like, wow, that's pretty cool because this is usually considered more of a right wing issue. So
Yeah, no, I think we're all against, prisons and jail time being used to punish for poverty, right? And I think that's where we're at.
yes,
But I think there has to be some means of how do we make sure that those children are taken care of. And it's hard to separate, the people who are in an unfortunate circumstance who have lost their job or are struggling to find full employment to be able to make those payments, and those who don't want to, right? Those who are go through it. Because while the numbers are higher, I think for women, it's still, isn't it something like 30%, only like 30% or 40% are fully paying all of their child support. Like
but
it's
hold on, I
it's
actually do
not the
have some
majority,
numbers.
isn't it?
It's actually pretty good.
It's Is
A
it?
large
I thought it was about
majority.
that. I thought that was
It's not
the
bad.
CDC numbers.
Hold on. Let me see. Um, okay. So you're right. It's not super great, but it's better than I thought. I think it's about 63% of custodial mothers received the full amount,
Okay, it's way better than I thought then. 63.
and 38% of fathers received their full amount.
Yeah.
So,
So I mean,
and when I
it's
poll my audience, it does appear from when I ask my own audience, men want to pay their child support. They don't have a problem paying their child support. When I consistently poll my audience, they seem to be okay with the child support part. It's the time piece that is what's
hmm.
making everyone so upset. Is they're like, what do I have to do to get equitable time seems to be the biggest issue. And then one other thing that I want to bring up in my like dream of how I would love to see family court work is one issue that I know that you and many people have is when men seek 50-50 custody for the sole purpose of trying to get out of child support
Yeah.
is I think that I have a solution for that. And it's a simple, like, I just wish that courts could simply follow a if you don't use it, you lose it policy with custody. Is give the men presumed custody, and it should be pretty easy to prove if they're not showing up, right? If they're having no involvement in this child's life,
Yeah.
just simply to be able to repetition to the court and say they are not utilizing their custody, let's put them on child support, I would be in support of that. Now, of course, if he then claims alienation, I think it should be taken seriously because you have to then question, like, if he can come back and prove this is me making reasonable efforts to see the child and being denied, then game back on, let's try to enforce this custodial time. But I feel like that would be a fair answer to resolve the issue of these men who allegedly attempt to get custody just to get out of child support.
I mean, it's an approach. Like I would wish you well on that, but I would also caution that I don't think that would solve anything. In that, I would disagree strongly that for the majority of men, it's about the custody time rather than the child support. Most of the fathers' rights guys that have talked to me and have like been attracted by my content and wanted to have an honest and open conversation with me have turned out to take that custody time argument, and if you dig down deep enough, then it becomes one about child support. I'm not going to mention him by name, but there's a guy who is kind of big in Iowa. He's on TikTok. He's kind of big in the Iowa Fathers' Rights group, and he has absolutely crowed about how he didn't get the custody time he wanted. It's only because he was born a man. And you go look at his court records, and he was actively telling the mother that, like, I just want 50-50 on paper. You can keep the kids. I just don't want the child support. There's a lot of discussion about Texas as well when we come to talking about fathers' rights issues and bias in courts. Jeff Younger has been all about how Texas courts are reducing custody time in order to increase child support payments and been making it all about that discussion. And he's wanting there to be more custody time, but he says the state is motivated by child support, and that's why he's good. But he's not making a child support argument; he's making a custody time argument. The problem is that Texas doesn't tie child support to custody time at all, and yet there are still people making those claims, and they're making those claims because it's the child support they object to, not the custody time. Because in Texas there is no tie between the two, so there can't be any bias or.
How did they determine their child support? I thought it was the
formula
flat rate.
Flat rate, 20% for your first kid, and I think it goes up by 5% for every kid afterwards. So it does not matter. Like, we have 50-50, but I pay full child support. I would pay the exact same amount today that I would pay if I had zero custody of my child.
Oh, that's so, not that I know what the perfect formula is.
Oh, neither do I. Like, every state is so different. Like, I know Texas because I'm in Texas, but I could not tell you the other 49 because they're extreme. And like, that's another problem, right? Like, of all of them having this ad hoc system as well. But yeah, in Texas, it's flat. And yet we still see those same arguments here. And it's like, well, if it's not about the child support, like Texas doesn't bias based off that. Like, it's very easy to get 50-50 here in the States. But there's still that complaint, and that complaint is all around the child support arguments. It's not because of custody time, because it just not doesn't exist here.
And that's going to be difficult to argue how many of the men who seek custody are doing so with the attempt to leverage child support, especially with the fact that men also are aware of the fact that even if they retain the 50-50 custody, they could very well still be ordered child support. Very often, child support agreements are ordered when 50-50 custody is attained.
Yeah, the only thing we know from like the studies, because like those state studies from like the 80s and the 90s do show in a couple of states men trying to use going for custody to manipulate those things. We have no idea how prevalent that is today. Absolutely. Like, it could be a very small number. It could be big. We just don't know. What we know from studies on how involved fathers are, though, is that there is a correlation between them actively paying child support and them being involved and having strong custody time. Now, we don't know which causes which. Right? Is it they want to be involved fathers, so they pay their child support so that they be involved, or is it the fact that if they don't pay their child support, then the mother's blocking access to seeing the kid and those kind of things? So we don't know. We do know though that pay your child support basically, because then your chances of being an involved father go up. But obviously, depending on your situation, that might not be as easy as just doing it. Especially if you're struggling to find work in, as everybody is these days, trying to struggle to make ends meet.
Right, because I certainly am of the belief that just because you're behind a bit on child support, I've heard women tell me that they call the custodial time pay to play, and if you're not paying, you're not seeing your child, and to me, that's not acceptable. I think the average debt of the average American is like $100,000, and if we're going to tell a father you don't have the parental rights to see your child because you're $1,000 behind, that's an insane and ludicrous denial of rights to me.
Yeah, but again, knowing how prevalent that is, right? We don't know the big issue or is it small, but it comes back to again, how are you showing up for your child, right? That thing is an obligation, and I can understand it can be an expensive obligation. It's definitely not always easy, if you're between jobs and going through it. But, that has always been a primary focus for me, is how am I going to make sure and getting ahead of that and putting that as my number one priority to make sure I meet on a monthly basis, right? And I think I'm like a month ahead when I pay mine because of that, right? To make sure we got that safety net and go through those things. But yeah, it's just hard, right? Because the other flip side of that, and I talked about this before, right? You're talking about, having that access of men who use the custody. That, there was a study that I think I've made 4 videos on it now, where, about, I think it's so it's 40% of men who have weekly or better custody abandon their children within 8 years. They go from weekly custody, they go from weekly visitation to yearly within 8 years, and just give up the custody they have. And this has been a huge talking point for me, because when when I was having my son, there was only one prenatal class for men. And that prenatal class for men was 15 minutes of changing a baby's diaper and learning how to take chocolate pudding off a doll, right? Like that was it. And the 45 minutes of it were basically a presentation of all of like, here's what your child's educational outcomes, incarceration rates, economic, viability, all of these things if you leave. And it was 45 minutes of basically two guys giving this PowerPoint presentation saying, don't leave, don't leave, don't leave. It'll get bad, don't leave. Because the attrition rate is horrific, and you look at studies that look at men's involvement post-divorce, and it's anything from like 25 to 50% after a couple of years just give up on their kids, and that's horrible. And it's one of the reasons why I know you're a big advocate for like default 50-50 default shared, where I struggle to advocate for that, because knowing those horrible attrition rates, I think it's horrible to set a child up in an environment where that father's going to be around and then leave them, because that is devastating. They spend the rest of their lives, asking what's wrong with me, why is that parent not involved? But yeah, I mean, maybe there's some sort of punishment if you don't use the custody that you have. Maybe you're right. Maybe there are some disadvantages that you have to face because of that. I don't know.
Yes,
It's a
yeah.
problem though.
And my hope would be that if we can start leveraging court systems to make custodial involvement more attainable without necessarily having to go through so much of an uphill legal battle just to get anything for the men who do have to fight, I think that hopefully we would see more more fathers
More
sticking
involvement. Yeah,
around.
no.
I'm gonna look more into these statistics that you're talking about, because that's very interesting, and I have not heard of this. You said 25% of unmarried or divorced fathers become
Non-resident
absent
fathers,
after
yeah, end up
eight
with that.
years.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Okay,
crazy, man. I mean, like, and that's the struggle, right? It's because those are guys who did have weekly custody. Like, I've heard often like a stat of around like 20% abandonment of like all fathers having no contact with their kids, and you're like, okay, sure, like guys that move away, or even guys that lose in court, right? If you lose that any custody visitation, like, I can imagine that number's that high because of that. But when you look at like, oh, even the fathers who have access and have high levels of it still walk away. And one of the big like risk factors for it is when they meet a new partner and start a new family. Like that seems to be the biggest risk factors. Having a daughter is a bigger risk factor. Moving away, which seems kind of obvious. If you move away, you're gonna see your kids less, or if the mom and the kid leave, and you're gonna see them less. It's gonna be harder. End up in a situation like your husband, where his choice is to just move across state, to if he wants to keep that up, right? Um, but yeah, so those are all risk factors, but the biggest ones are finding a new partner and having a child with that new partner. Those are the big ones that then, they have a ready-made family at home. They're less inclined to go visit the old family, unfortunately.
now I would be remiss to not bring up this, because I know that there's a lot of fathers in the chat right now who are like burning at both ends if I don't say something
Let's
right
go.
now.
No, go for it.
But you have to know that when a new partner is introduced in the man's life, it
Hmm.
is very, very common for the mother of the child to react negatively. Do you disagree?
I mean that's an opinion statement. I don't know where like there would be numbers to back that up, right? Like, could it be? Sure. I haven't experienced it. I don't know that I know others that have. I mean, could it be? Possibly, but I mean, all we can say for certainty is that when that occurs, the involvement rates drop off, and it's not because they are limited, right? They had a custody order that granted them access. They're not choosing to use it. Now, it could be, you're right, that there's contention there. To the police, to the court, to enforce a court order that you have is always an option. Um, But you're right. Like could be because there's conflict there, but we don't know that, right? We can't say one way. Is it because men are uninterested, or is it because they go for it? What I can say is that we can look at the high levels of father abandonment generally outside of it. When you look at like how prevalent single mother households are, to see, it feels very much like that's consistent with what we see elsewhere outside of custody cases and divorces. Even in unwed fathers, there's that high level, and so I don't know.
I think that down the line we may start to see a little bit more of an overlap where we observe these metrics of, oh, well, he found a new partner and so he just chose to abandon the family, versus when more claims of parental alienation start to be taken seriously. Because in the course of almost every study that you sent me, it is frequently kind of cast aside by many as, this is an unstudied claim. And a lot of people now there are a lot of your studies did cite that there are a lot of judges who do take parental alienation seriously,
Yeah,
despite it not being studied. But I would say that there's probably just as many, if not more, who, because of how unstudied parental alienation is, just do not take the claims seriously whatsoever. But I believe that there's a very big overlap between the fathers who are allegedly abandoning their children versus games are being played to make things.
Well, again, I mean, I don't know. We'd actually have to see data and studies on that, right? The ones that I've looked at that looked at alienation, like I said, show that right, that when a mother was alleged of being alienating, men took custody like 44% of the time. Like, it's pretty high. Like, not that I would be out there giving like crappy legal advice because I am not a lawyer, but it seems based off the data on alienation, it's a pretty solid defense for a dude. Like, if you're in court and you're being accused of something, claim that she's alienating you, because according to the statistics, it works out really well for you in terms of grabbing custody. I'd have to see other studies or other data that show that those rates are actually lower. But yeah, I mean, at least according to, like I said, the Department of Justice's study on it, that they show that it's pretty high rates.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look a little bit more into that one as well, because from my understanding, it's definitely not majorative. That parental alienation is considered. But I will say, I know that we're about at your time that you were hoping to join your.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go a little longer if you've got more that you wanted to.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you had any final things that you didn't get a chance to, I'm like going through mine. I'm like, what else did I knock it off my chest?
I don't think so. Like I said, I think overall my point is just the same, right? I think gender bias in family court is one of the most studied aspects of child custody. And I think, like I said, you've got 32 state studies that have been done over that 20-year period. You've got all of the district court studies that have been done. You have the independent studies that have been done, and all of them show at least, 40% or higher rates for men who seek custody for getting custody, right? And whether you want to talk about whether it's sole custody or physical custody, the numbers start to move around. But it doesn't seem like it's less than a 50-50 shot for men to go to court and get sole custody when they're asking for it, at least across the majority of studies. So I think that's there. The horrible problem, I think we both agree, is that men are just actively discouraged from going to seek custody. That going to court itself is an incredibly expensive affair. It is hugely exorbitant, and that might be part of the reason why families are discouraged from going to court, is because they're worried that there's that big expense. I don't think, like I said, men are often aware that they can just ask for more custody from the judge, and when they're there in front of them. And that's definitely something I would take away from this is, be active beforehand. If you end up in that situation where things are unfortunately going wrong in your marriage and in your relationship, make sure that you are being involved even as you're separated, because this all looks great when you go to court that you are an involved father. and be genuine, right? Be present in that child's life because you want to be present in that child's life. If you're showing up or trying to do this because you just want to pay less child support, or you want to, to get revenge against her, you want to take sole custody from her because, like, she hurt you, or she like, you unfortunately have to be the bigger person and let it go. Because I think, as you've probably seen, you talked about how, your husband's situation is an amicable co-parent decision. You have to put the children first. There are going to be times where there's conflict. There's going to be times where, you're like, whoa, but you have to let all of that ego and pride go and put the children first. Like, that's where.
Yeah. I think we can both agree as co-parents that it's so important for both sides to make concessions. You have to be reasonable. You have to be agreeable. You have to be present. You have to be present and active. And what was the other big point? Oh yeah. I also feel like a big takeaway from both of our points, it is obvious that there is gender bias against both men and women in family courts when they act outside of their assigned gender roles. That's the biggest takeaway that I've had from here, is when women do not behave submissive, when they choose to go to work, when they choose to have a partner, they are seen less favorably. And when men step outside of their roles and they are not choosing to be the earners and choosing to be less involved so that they can earn more, they are seen less favorably. And so, gosh dang it, we just got to get out of this gender role stuff, man.
Yeah, 100%. Like, and that goes far beyond, family court and all the rest of it. And I think, I can't tell you the number of times where being an involved dad with a young child, right? How many times other mothers would be saying to me, like, how do I get my child's father this involved? How do I get them to do this? Or there's consistent stories of, like, the father having to take custody of the child while she wants to go shopping, and, like, getting a call 15 or 20 minutes later, like, can you come? Like, yes, it's unfair that we talk about some of these things. This is not all men, but it is unfortunately a lot of fathers. And I think, regardless of what is going on the other side, men need to be better about holding each other accountable and encourage us to be better fathers and more involved with our children, because ultimately that's going to lead to happier lives for everybody involved.
Agree. We definitely agree there. Well, did you, by any chance, want to maybe take any questions for the chat? There have been people clamoring to get in here, but I know we don't.
I have not seen any in my chat. I don't know. So if you've got questions or if you've seen them, I'm happy to talk them through with you or talk about stuff. So yeah.
I think that this is someone from your side. Remove the filth, says Lauren. Come join the feminists. You could actually do good here. We welcome you. I think that people would be really shocked to find out that I'm still desperately clinging to the title of feminist. I think that people would be very shocked because what do feminists believe? That men and women should have equitable opportunities. That's what I believe. So I'm not a feminist. I think most people are, even if they don't identify as one.
No, but I think a large part of, being a part of that group and being part of that cause, though, is kind of like the work we're trying to do, right? Of decentering every conversation for being about women, right? Of actually having a space where we can talk about men, right? Where we can as fathers talk to other fathers about holding fathers accountable and encouraging them without it having to be, and I think the big problem is always the conversation gets flipped around to, well, what about women? What about mothers? Like, let them handle that side. Let's take care of our side, right? Let's challenge, like you talked about, those societal gender roles. Let's encourage, our spouses when we're in those hetero relationships, if there are our wives and our mothers, to go out to work, to live the lives they want. If they want to be stay-at-home moms, great. Then let's work those situations out. If we want a 50-50 partnership and that we're doing equal childcare, like, let's work that out. Like, let's be open to all of those. And just work out what's best for our families, rather than going in with rigid expectations of, I'm going to do this, my partner's going to do this, and that's how it's going to be. And a lot of times those change, right? That was one of the things with me and our story was, like, there's seasons. there are times when you are doing more of the load, there's times when you're doing less, and it's about making sure that all along the way that you are stepping in and fulfilling the role in your family that is needed rather than, well, no, I signed up to be the breadwinner and I don't do childcare. Like, maybe you have to for a year or two while, your partner is studying or wanting to go back to school, or, maybe they've
I'm
decided
a
that
big
being a stay at home
advocate.
is not that appealing.
I'm a big advocate for switching the roles somehow, at least once, like do a chore swap week, something that will allow you to get some kind of perspective of what your partner is doing. I could not encourage that more. It's just tough because it's not like, stay-at-home wives can just like go to their husband's job and
Yeah.
vice versa all the time.
No, no, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, but like you say, it's switching up the roles when needed. Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, and people are bringing up good points. They're like, if you want men to be home more, you got to give men more paternity leave. I'm sure you completely agree with that, though. I'm sure you're like,
I
heck
mean,
yeah.
honestly, coming from the other side of the pond, from the land of Europe, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we give crazy amounts of paternity leave over there, but again, these are all of that same problem, right? Like, so this is where, we get into, okay, so we're talking about men's issues, but they're tied into those patriarchal gender role expectations. And I know that, like, when we have a lot of these conversations, everybody's eyes roll, right? As soon as you mention the word feminism or patriarchy, they're like, oh God, it's always the patriarchy, and they just switch off, right? But it's important that, like, when we have these discussions, like you say, you talk about those things because those expectations are what are really harming men, right? This idea that, well, men are going to be the ones that work, right? I've talked before about how, like, this all changed with the Industrial Revolution, and that it used to be families worked and lived in the same, building or area, either in farmlands or owning their own small shops and stores. And so you had a wealthy, you had mom, dad, you had, unmarried aunts and uncles as part of the family, and you had neighbors that were all like community caring for the children, and so you could do these things. And then that all changed. Men started being sent off to the office buildings and the factories while mom was staying at home and dealing with the kids, and those got locked. And we're dealing with the aftermath of that, trying to fight out of those, and that's why it's important that we talk about these things. As much as I'm sure everybody's sick of hearing, oh God, it's the patriarchy. Like, it is, but you need to understand that by fighting these and coming and changing these laws and these expectations, they're a benefit to men as well, and we'll be leading happier lives because of it.
Yeah, I think the reason that patriarchy is such a trigger word for so many men is because while men love having the conversation about how the ways in which men are socialized have actually ended up harming them, it seems like every time the patriarchy gets brought up, as it is in even my comment section right now, it's almost like weaponized against men and forcing them to like
Sure.
take the blame for all these people who lived hundreds of years before them. And so it almost turns into this thing that then is not productive because we have, I
Yeah.
got one person in my comment section right now going, well, the only reason there's not paternity leave is because men made those laws. And it's like, okay, but that statement doesn't help. Like, you pointing that out is just pissing off all the men who didn't make those laws but aren't getting paternity leave.
No, it's important to acknowledge, right? Like when we talk about that stuff, that the reason there hasn't been change is because there's people who don't want it to change, and this is why it's important for men to speak and talk out and advocate, because for a lot of time the only people who have been speaking out about this and wanting to change these things have been women, who have been largely marginalized, largely ignored, and so that's why it's important get on to like, yes, paternity laws suck. I'm voting based on paternity laws. I'm voting based off, people who are progressive and are more open to, different gender roles and different marriage structures than simply the traditional roles. And it's not to say there's anything wrong with the traditional roles. If that is what you and your partner sign up for, everybody is 100% on board with it. What we're about is giving people more choice, so that when we come into a situation where, your spouse is more educated, and so she can go out and go earn more, and you've lost your job, your well-paying job, and now all of a sudden you can't be the breadwinner. Well, you guys can adapt and work around that and still have that situation and an option open to you, rather than like what we've got right now, which is like you won't get paternity leave, you won't get these things. Like you are expected to be the breadwinner, you're expected to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week and not see your kids, and that's not good for you at all.
Yep, I agree. And that's the thing is there's actually so many things that we agree on because at the end of the day, you and I are fighting for the same thing. I think that if anybody came here and they're leaving with the takeaway that you are anti-man and only pro-woman, well, probably was not listening well enough. It's where there's
Yeah,
so many things that we do agree on.
yeah, and it's that thing of, we're not necessarily wanting to blame men for the systems that other men have set up. It's all simply about not perpetuating that same harm and continuing the same things, right? Of we can be smarter, we can learn and we can change. And that's literally it, beginning and end.
Well, cool. All right. I know, I'm just trying to see if there's like any loose ends in the comments because it's as far as conclusively determining things, like I said, I think that we can conclusively determine that there are gender biases whenever we step outside of those traditional gender roles that both sides will face, and that the numbers for men will get better. We can both agree on that when men
They have though, right? And that's the encouraging thing, right? They have, like I said, from the 1980s where mothers were getting 80% of sole custody to where they're not getting it in anywhere those numbers, to the fact where joint and unequal custody is flipped over for men, that men continue to get more custody year on year, is good, you know? Yeah, agreed.
Yay.
Well, appreciate it, Lauren. And thank you for giving me your time tonight. And like I said, I really appreciate you, reaching out so that we could have this conversation and being open to the discussion. And yeah, it's just, I
Yes.
really appreciated it and enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh yeah, and to anybody, because a couple people have mentioned it down below. To anybody who by any chance did not ever see me clarify this, ex-patriarch has a child. I was wrong when I said that he was childless. I did not do my research on that one. He does have a child.
Yeah, I mean, Lauren,
Just
look at all the gray. Like, where do you think this comes from? Can't be.
yeah, that's gonna pass
Absolutely.
bracket, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And you're an involved father, so you wear that tinsel with pride.
Yeah, yeah, and that was the thing. Like, here in Texas, it was very much just a, show up and like, hey, you want 50? Yeah, cool. All right, like rubber stamped and straight out. Because
And
again,
you were divorced when they
mhm.
established the 50-50? Because I do find that men who were married tend to have higher chances of getting the custody. But okay, wait, one last question, because
Oh,
Destiny
go for
said
it.
something kind of crazy when he was arguing about this. He said that this is why you should marry the mothers. You should marry the mother of your child so that you can have better custody. And I actually disagree with that.
I
I
think
think
his point,
there's
right, was you were
custody.
talking about, how if you are, and I'm, you know, talking about, the situation you had with your husband where he was not wed. And then correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, please, Lauren, because I'm talking your story and I don't really know
You
you.
actually understand it pretty
Um,
well.
and he was going for custody and fighting an uphill battle because the presumption is for unwed mothers, it's total custody. The man is shut out completely. Um, and I think I'm not sure that I would 100% say that like that's a great reason to get married. I think Destiny's point was a little more around like this is a reason to do it because then you won't face those uphill custody battles. But I don't think anybody should get married to somebody they don't like and don't want to spend the rest of their life with just to affect custody decisions. Um, but I will say though, like again, I think context is important to know why those laws are in place, right? So the reason why mothers were are given this sole custody is because of illegitimate children. And so the idea is any woman could say, I have a child and that's ex-patriarch's kid and I'm getting him for all of his jelly baby money, right? Like I want 50% of the jelly babies he eats, which is a lot, I will tell you right now. She'd be living large. And so the laws were that like, okay, if she's not married to him, then we don't want to automatically give him legal responsibility and eligibility over that child, because now that child gets 50% of his inheritance. Now that child is legally tied to him. I have to pay for that child. I'm financially responsible for it, because these are parish laws from like 19th century. Parish would be ones that did the upkeep, because there wasn't as much of a central government, right? It's a local government that would be, either putting them into parish, what are they called? When you don't have any parents, Batman, gosh, orphanages. They would put them into orphanages or workhouses for children that didn't have parents. So it was really important to establish that paternity, because those, the parish wouldn't have to pay for them. So that's why it was like, okay, men didn't want that. They didn't want to automatically be tied to any child that these mothers had, especially if they were unwed, because they didn't want them to get inheritance despite having these illegitimate children. And so that's why those laws are still there. Now, I think you're right in that, are they perhaps outdated? Absolutely. But that would tie straight back into the conversation about single mothers and the rates at which those unwed fathers are not involved in their children. Yeah.
Because, these also include cases, though, of even when the father is on the birth certificate or the affidavit of parentage, that sexual custodianship still applies to the biological unmarried mother.
Yeah, blame my home country, right? I mean, a lot of America's outdated laws come from, British common law and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I mean, are 200-year-old statutes and laws still relevant, to today? Probably not. And that may be that something needs to be examined. And maybe it is something where, again, it looks status quo. It's similar to how custody decisions are done for divorcing couples, where they would look at how involved and how active that father was in that child's life beforehand. I think that would be a much fairer thing. But
I don't even think we brought up the tender years doctrine, which was the common law throughout the country that it is assumed mothers get custody. That was it wasn't even eliminated legally. Text itself was replaced with best interest of the children in like the 70s.
Correct.
But in Michigan, this wasn't even like fully written into anything until like 1981. So I feel like we're still pretty behind in Michigan as far as that kind of thing goes.
Yeah, but that was to me like why those old state studies are so important. Because I think, one of the things in your reply, you'd said like, oh, well, they're 30-year-old studies, right? And I think there's absolutely a point of these studies can be indicative, but they don't describe the current reality, right? Because they're 3 decades out. But I think to me, that's why they're so important to look at, because for most of those state studies, they were written through the late 80s, early 90s, when tender years doctrine was being replaced in most states for best interest of the child status quo. And so you've got a snapshot of essentially when courts were at their most biased. And you do find a lot of those reports say, like personal views of the judges, like in Maryland, where they're like, yeah, I think all things being equal, mothers are, good parents, and we shouldn't, pull custody from mothers in a large cases, because they're still thinking along those lines. But then, at the same time, they're also being progressive and showing that when fathers are involved, they're giving him more credence, they're giving them a lot more bias, they're giving a lot more strength to involve fathers, right? They're seeing even the fathers that at that stage are not, we're not living in the 2020s with the progressive families then, but we're living in what that would look like in the 80s, and still rewarding those fathers who are showing up and being involved. Like, I think that's why I was like, those studies are a good read. But like I said, there's a lot of them, Lauren. Like there's 30 of them, and those things are not short, they're long.
Yeah. But there's a lot to be found in it, and I'm glad that I did, pour through them as much as I did.
Yeah,
and it was the easiest discussion ever if I just showed up and was like, well, we can't do this because there's all.
No, absolutely.
So, but good. I hope that we can keep encouraging people to have these civil discussions, to do the introspection, to hold themselves accountable if they get any information wrong, as we've both been, I think, pretty good models of this evening in this discussion.
Yeah, Honestly, I love it because it's usually like something new that I didn't know before, and you're like, oh, great, I'm an idiot. Okay.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to be looking into that whole attrition statistic of fathers who gain
I'll send you the
custody
study.
but then just start to slowly disappear, because I would love to look more into that, the causes, what we
Yeah.
can do to make that better.
So I
Because
don't
at the
think
end of the
that one
day,
itself by looks into the causes. There's a couple of others that look. So like, there's a couple others that look into the causes. So I can give you both. I can give you all of the studies.
yeah, I
Give
never
you
want
lots
to
of
be a
reading.
person who's arguing just to argue, and even when presented with information that could change my mind, just try to find ways to just pretend it doesn't exist. I always want to be able to grow as a creator, and the only way to do that is by talking to people who people think I have TikTok beef with.
Yeah, I mean it's not as entertaining, right? Like it's a lot more miserable to watch two people getting on and just having a reasonable conversation about, okay, well I disagree, all right,
Everyone's
well, I
pissed at me
disagree,
for this.
rather
Yeah.
than But I look forward, like, hey, you're getting. I look forward to seeing the video of like Advocate slams ex-patriarch. Let's go.
I know. I literally I thought about like starting it and being like, all right, guys, this is why we fucking hate Brent.
Yeah, just let me know when you make that video. I'll get my fiance involved. She's gonna give you a list. She can give you a reason. She's got a long list.
Yeah, she's like, have you seen the way he folds towels? Like, I got you, Advocate. Let's partner shame
Yeah,
Brent right
yeah. He cannot load a dishwasher for his life. I've tried teaching him. He's unteachable.
You seem like the kind of guy who, if your wife actually
I know, you just yell,
load the
that's true.
dishwasher,
Oh, thank you.
I
Appreciate
feel like
that.
you would make a video about it, about how you don't want to fail other men by refusing to learn how to load a dishwasher. Especially
Look,
after the whole, like, didn't you just make an entire mashup of various
about like doing
personalities who
the
are just
laundry,
like
yeah, no.
flexing on how they
So
don't know how to do domestic life?
so yeah, I'm gonna say, look, I have a partner who has ADHD, who's a little OCD. I don't think anybody could load that dishwasher correctly for that woman. I love her to bits, but but yes, I have tried. I have tried to learn from her, but apparently that's also true. So I mean, look, we know who we are. I know to stay away from the dishes and do other things.
That's funny. TJ's my dishes guy, and I'm the laundry girl. I don't do any dishes, so high five for getting
Look,
out of dishes.
I was gonna say, hi, I'm with you. Like even loading
We
the
did it.
dishwasher, no, no. I will cook all day. I will make whatever elaborate meals you want. I just don't want to handle a dish afterwards, especially when your fingers touch food. No, out, done.
What? You're a dad and you're grossed out by food. I don't know if I'm grossed out by anything anymore.
Yeah, that is the power of a parent. That first time when you walk outside with like something on an unrecognized, you're like, I don't know what that is. I don't care. We still need milk. I'm going out.
Yep.
Well,
Chain
cool. I
over.
appreciate it, Lauren. Your conversation. Appreciate it. And
Yes.
if there's anything else that you see in my videos and you're like, let's go. I'd love to have a conversation again.
Yes, it will be worth it. Everyone will learn a lot every time.
All right. Appreciate it. Thanks again. Have yourself a great evening.
You too.